It's an informal truce. It's quite uneasy in a lot of ways. It's probably not something that the groups themselves would have, entered into of their own accord.
Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Thursday, June 19, the imprisoned State Councillor Do Aung San Suu Kyi's 80th birthday. There's been a lot happening this week, as usual, including India deporting more Rohingya refugees that hold United Nations refugee cards, and a new controversial civil disobedience movement law from the exiled committee representing Pidongsu Hluttaw. And then the military raiding cyber scam centres in Muse, arresting over 100 people. For a day-by-day account of all this and more, do remember to subscribe to Frontier Myanmar's daily briefing newsletters. Because today on the show, for episode 32, we're going to hear from Thomas Kean about a new report from the International Crisis Group that warns of renewed Rohingya armed group organising in the Cox's Bazaar refugee camps of Bangladesh. Tom is senior consultant for Myanmar and Bangladesh with Crisis Group, and he's also a director and editor-at-large of Frontier Myanmar. But before getting to that, the important war waged by the Arakan Army, or AA, against the Myanmar military has been overlooked the last few weeks of this show, as we've been zeroing in on the Thailand border and the Da'an land struggle. So today, an update to set the context for these warnings of Rohingya revolution. The AA is continuing to directly threaten two of the three areas still resisting the group's domination of Rakhine State, with increasing pressure on Kyaukphyu and its Danyawadi naval base over the last week. AA soldiers are within 5 kilometres of the Kyaukphyu town proper, and the AA has seized military positions along the routes linking Kyaukphyu to the nearby Danyawadi base. Over last weekend, dozens of military soldiers reportedly surrendered to the AA from Kyaukphyu, led by an army major. The AA still doesn't control the air or the seas, but its vices around both Sittwe and Kyaukphyu are only tightening. Explosions are getting closer to populated areas and are increasingly threatening Kyaukphyu Airport. Both the AA and the military are keeping silent on the fighting in Kyaukphyu, which is home to major Chinese investments and projects. Outside of Rakhine State, the AA is also continuing to menace multiple conflict theatres in Ayeyarwady, Magwe and Bago, with their advances out of Rakhine State continuing to progress, or at least hold steady in all areas. Their allies, the Asho Chin Defence Force, this week claimed to have detained another 26 military troops that fled their posts along the Badan Road, which links An in Rakhine State to Magwe. Some of the troops left the Nat Yikan air defence base, which is a key target for the AA. As reported in a Frontier feature on June 6, an AA victory at the Nat Yikan base would make it easier for resistance groups to operate right throughout Magwe, where the State Administration Council, or SAC, has many arms factories and other logistics facilities. Meanwhile, the SAC's blockades on essential goods and widespread phone and internet cuts since November last year continued to make life difficult right across Rakhine State and slow the institutionalisation of an AA administration that can integrate and interface with its neighbours or further abroad. The economic situation is dire. There are fears of forced recruitment and civilians live under threat of airstrikes and landmines. The AA has deactivated 500 landmines in Donggup town alone since November, when the SAC retreated from the area. And now, the AA could be contending with another challenge, as we'll hear from Tom in just a moment, after this short announcement. Cue the music. Have you heard of Do Athan? You know, What's Happening in Myanmar isn't the only podcast that Frontier puts out. Do Athan is a bilingual English and Burmese language podcast that focuses on human rights. This week there's a new episode out about life in Anya during a time of fierce opposition to military rule. If you haven't checked out Doathan yet, it's on all the apps. That's DOHATHAN. Our Voice. Okay, now back to it. It's a real pleasure to have joined me on this little wireless program, my friend and colleague Tom Kean. Hi, Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Luke.
So going back to your last appearance on this show, which was from that panel that Frontier Myanmar did on the change in regime in Bangladesh, at that time you talked about the potential for what you termed a, quote, Rohingya insurgency in northern Rakhine State. Well, 7 months on, now the Arakan Army controls the entire Bangladesh border, almost the whole of Rakhine State, and fighting has forced many thousands more Rohingya to flee, particularly from Butadawan and Maungdaw townships, into those camps in Bangladesh. And now you're even more concerned about these largely stateless refugees from picking up arms in a more organised way. Your recent report with the International Crisis Group, published just yesterday, focuses on how coordinated armed attacks on the Arakan Army from these refugees would actually hurt rather than help them to return home and to live in peace.
Yeah, that's right. That's a pretty accurate summary. Thanks, Luke.
So what sort of organising is going on in these camps? I mean, why are you concerned?
Yeah, so I started working on this report sort of around the end of last year or early this year because there were already some signs that Rohingya armed groups were becoming more active in the camps in terms of recruitment. In November last year, there was an informal agreement reached between the four main Rohingya armed groups to end the turf war in the camps. So an informal truce, and to focus their attention on Rakhine State, on the Arakan Army. And since then, they began holding rallies, community meetings in the camps. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, the message was, we need to fight for our homeland. We need to take up arms to fight the Arakan Army. The largest of these rallies was on December 25 last year, so probably around 10,000, maybe more people in attendance. But they have continued since the start of the year and haven't really slowed down. So I think this is very concerning. Rohingya armed groups are not going to have the strength to fight against the Arakan Army, to take it on in a serious way. But they could do a huge amount of damage on both sides of the border. If we think about what would happen to Rohingya civilians who are remaining in northern Rakhine if they were caught between the Rohingya armed groups and the Arakan Army. I think we would see larger refugee outflows as a result. Already, we're seeing some effects in the camps. The Rohingya armed groups have become the kind of most influential actors within the camps. And so they're undermining the civilian character of the camps. And that has implications for humanitarian assistance delivery, for example. People feel intimidated by the presence of these armed groups within the camps. And I think it's the narrative, the message that they're spreading is quite dangerous as well. That the Arakan Army is a greater enemy than the Myanmar military, and that armed struggle is the only way for Rohingya people to get their rights and to get their homeland in Rakhine State. So that's why we wrote this report, and that's what we're concerned about.
Okay, that's understood. And this report, it's detailed. It even has a sort of political control overview map of the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, which I hadn't seen before. I think listeners would be familiar with the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, ARSA, but you also mention another three groups that have power in the camps and that formed this uneasy truce with ARSA. So is any one group in control, like calling the shots now?
These groups have, until quite recently, been fighting each other within the camps. There was a bloody turf war that ran for almost 2 years in and around the camps, particularly between the group you mentioned, ARSA, and another one called Rohingya Solidarity Organization, or RSO. And so this is it's an informal truce. It's quite uneasy in a lot of ways. It's probably not something that the groups themselves would have, entered into of their own accord. But Bangladesh security agencies were involved in orchestrating this agreement, and so the groups themselves were under a bit of pressure to comply. And it has had some positive effects in the sense that the turf war has ended. There's still violence and insecurity in the camps to some extent, but it's not at the levels that we've seen in the past. But the downside is this attempt to mobilize the community, for an armed struggle. Using, framing this armed struggle in religious terms as well in an attempt to mobilize. And so, I think there are just many things to be concerned about in terms of who's doing what exactly and who the different groups are. So you do have ARSA, which was the group that carried out the attacks in northern Rakhine in 2016, 2017. RSO, which has become more powerful in recent years, so since around 2022, 2023. They're the two main ones, and then another one is Islamic Mahaz, and then Arakan Rohingya Army as well, which was previously accused of being a drug trafficking gang. So it's a bit up for debate as to whether it's an armed group in the sense of having really a political ideology. But it is one of the main armed actors in the camp. So they're the four main groups. ARSA is more active within northern Rakhine State itself. So they have been carrying out some attacks against civilians and against Arakan Army since late last year. Whereas RSO is more powerful within the camps and has been more involved in the recruitment activities, along with an individual named Dil Mohammed, who was said to be close to the Myanmar military in northern Rakhine in the past, and fled to Bangladesh last year. He's become an influential figure in terms of organizing these community events within the camps.
Right, thinking about influential figures, it feels like it wasn't too long ago that the leader of ARSA was actually arrested near Dhaka. But now ARSA is, actually maybe on the ascendance once again. So what was the significance of that arrest?
Yeah, the short name is Ataullah. So he rose to prominence in 2016, 2017 when ARSA carried out its attacks in northern Rakhine. So he was arrested in mid-March near Dhaka, and my understanding is that the security agencies felt like he was inflexible. He wasn't following the scripts that he maybe wanted him to follow, and that's one reason why he was arrested. I think also it was an attempt from the Bangladesh government, the interim government in Bangladesh, to gain some trust with the Arakan Army. So they had recently just held their first informal meeting with Arakan Army's political wing, and so there was an attempt being made at the time to improve the relationship, to build trust. So I think the arrest needs to be seen in that context. As to the effect, well, after the arrest, ARSA stepped up their attacks in northern Rakhine, particularly at the end of March. And I think that was a direct response to Ataullah being arrested. The contacts that I spoke to said that ARSA needed to show that it was still relevant, still active, particularly to its supporters in the diaspora. ARSA is quite heavily supported financially by expatriate Rohingya around the world, but particularly in Malaysia and Saudi Arabia. And so it's important for the group to show that the support that these people are providing is going towards fulfilling the group's objectives, and that it's still active. So an element of it, I think, was to create or generate videos of ARSA members carrying out attacks within Rakhine and showing some sort of impact on the ground. So it had if the intention was to build trust with the Arakan Army. It had a little bit of a perverse effect, I guess, in the sense that it led to an escalation of conflict in northern Rakhine.
And do you think this arrest is also an example of how the interim government in Bangladesh and the Bangladesh military and its other state armed institutions are just not in lockstep at all? The security institutions, as you say, you call them, are doing their own thing. The interim government is trying to do its own thing. How's that dynamic shaping what's going on? And with the prospects for an election in Bangladesh or other political change in Bangladesh, could that dynamic change so that the government of Bangladesh and the military in Bangladesh are on the same page?
It does often appear that the strategy and the approaches, the policies of the civilian government in Bangladesh are a bit not in tune with what's actually happening on the ground in Cox's Bazar, where we do have these, for example, the recruitment activities going on in the camps quite openly. And, that recruitment, the activities of the armed groups is undermining the attempts from the interim government to engage with the Arakan Army. From the Arakan Army point of view, how can we have a positive relationship with Bangladesh while Rohingya armed groups are, being given space to build up their strength and potentially mount an insurgency? That is going to be a fundamental barrier to having positive relations. So, it does seem that there is maybe a lack of coordination on the Bangladesh side between the different actors. And the army in Bangladesh is quite powerful, and its different security agencies, its wings are quite influential. And I think there's a question as to whether the interim government has the ability to really exert authority over them. And even if it does have the ability, whether it wants to expend the political capital that would take. I think that's quite unclear at this point. But there is, a contradiction, I think, on the Bangladesh side in terms of what they say they want, or what the approach they say they want to take, which is quite, it's working with the international community, working with Arakan Army to advance repatriation. You've got that as the stated objective, but on the ground, it looks more like Rohingya armed groups are being given space and a level of support to build up their strength to fight against the Arakan Army.
Yeah, right. And if we sort of center the individual a little bit, if we think about the Rohingya people in the camp, they're essentially stateless. They have very few opportunities. They receive very little aid. They can't work. They can't go home. Trying to reach a third country is extremely dangerous. The basic dignity of an individual living in these camps, it's been declining really ever since you started work on this report. It wasn't exactly high to begin with. The United States, USAID, has been giving up on its aid program. Now the AA controls the whole border, and there have been thousands of new arrivals competing for resources. All of this pressures the Rohingya people in these camps. I guess the question I'm going to ask is whether there's a connection between this nascent potential embrace of armed conflict and the deteriorating living conditions in the camps. Less hope, no hope. Is there a connection?
Yeah. No, I think there is a connection there. Yes, over the past 12 months or so, there have been two important developments here. One is the Arakan Army taking control of Buthiram and Mongdor, and in the process, allegations of human rights abuses against Rohingya civilians, and some Rohingya being forced to flee into Bangladesh. So that's one element of it. And then the other element is the increasingly challenging living conditions in the camps, which are a product of a lack of funding for the humanitarian response. You mentioned USAID. So USAID the US government provided 55% of the funding for the Rohingya response last year in 2024. They've pulled most of that funding, so there's a huge hole that has opened up. And given the global context, it's not realistic to expect other countries to step up and plug that hole. The UN that leads the response is going to have to, adjust to having significantly less funds available. And we're already seeing the effects of that in terms of health centers closing down. Earlier this month, UNICEF was forced to lay off around 1,200 teachers who were working in the camps. And the other services are being cut back. There's only funding for food support at current levels until around September. After that, it's very unclear what will happen. And so generally there's this sense that on the one hand, prospects for repatriation are diminishing, conditions in the camps are getting more difficult, and you've got armed groups attempting to recruit at this time, and you've also got a sense that the Arakan Army is a force that can't be trusted, that the Rohingya can't trust, and that was evident last year, in the way that the Arakan Army carried out its campaign in Rakhine State. So the armed groups are using these developments to recruit, either explicitly or implicitly. I mean, they don't necessarily talk about the lack of funding in the camps. What they say is like, we can't stay here in Bangladesh forever. We need to go back to our homeland. This is not where we belong. But they do talk about the Arakan Army, being the enemy of the Rohingya people. And that resonates to some extent because of what unfolded last year in northern Rakhine. Now, I would say, so what we saw in our research was that there was strong support for the idea of armed struggle. Pretty much every Rohingya refugee that we interviewed said they supported the idea of armed struggle. They thought that was, the potential solution to their plight. But it was very far from uniform support for the existing Rohingya armed groups, which have a reputation for, treating the refugee, the camp population quite badly. And this has been over a period of years. So a lot of the refugees do have an aversion still to the armed groups. But I think what we're seeing is that there are enough people in the camps who are at the point where they're like, well, we don't have any other hope. We don't have any other options. So why don't I join one of these armed groups, and at least I'll have some power, some influence, and probably earn some money from being a part of one of these groups. So they're not necessarily having a huge amount of trouble recruiting, even though they're still not particularly popular among the refugee community.
Thanks. Okay. And so let's just say that this potential Rohingya insurgency does not eventuate, right? And you write in the report that this uneasy truce could break down between armed groups and fighting could resume in the camps. Now, if that happened, you say that the harm would actually be worse than before the truce, because over the last 6 months, these groups have inflated their ranks. You just mentioned the recruitment, and increased their firepower. So I want to ask you about the firepower element. I mean, where are these guns coming from, and what do you know about that increase in firepower? And do you want to say anything more about how this could end badly just within the camps, let alone it going outside the camps?
Yeah, I see this as one of the main risks for Bangladesh, in terms of giving these groups space and the leash to carry out these activities, is that the truce could break down and the violence could escalate within the camps beyond the levels that we previously saw in 2023, 2024, when it was quite bad. In terms of the weapons, I mean, these groups are still not particularly well armed by Myanmar standards. It's not like that they're getting weapons from, large amounts of weapons from the Bangladesh army or anything like that. They still do have trouble sourcing weapons. And it's also quite difficult for them to provide training to recruits, because you can't really, the camps are so congested, like there's no way to do that, surreptitiously or in secret. And so there is some training going on in camps along the border that are as in military camps, not Bangladesh military camps, but like armed group camps along the border that are outside the refugee camps. But that is a challenge for the armed groups, the access to weapons and access just to places to train new recruits. So they're kind of reasons why it will be difficult for the Rohingya armed groups to seriously take on the Arakan Army. I mean, the Arakan Army has essentially defeated the Myanmar military in Rakhine, sorry, despite the military being able to call upon, the Air Force and Navy, having artillery, having all this equipment that the Arakan Army doesn't have. So this is after 5 years or so of fighting. This is a very battle-hardened force with access to weapons, with access to recruits that are well trained. And so it is really just inconceivable that Rohingya armed groups could really carry out a successful insurgency if that, as I said, if the truce breaks down and the Rohingya armed groups begin to look inward again rather than towards Rakhine, that could be really disastrous for the camp population.
And do you think there's anything politically that the Arakan Army can do to prevent this, to signal to Rohingya people that there might be hope for them in their birthplaces? Correct me if I'm wrong, but in your report, there's not as much perspective from the AA. I think maybe you didn't talk to as many people in the AA as on the Bangladesh side.
Look, I think the Arakan Army has in the past said some positive things about its intentions towards the Rohingya and how it views the community. It said some negative things. And what kind of matters really is what the group does on the ground and how it approaches its relations with the Rohingya community. And I think that's still kind of unclear. And maybe part of that is because of a level of dysfunction within the Arakan Army administration, in the sense that it has this large territory that it's trying to administer, yet it's still fighting actively against the Myanmar military in various parts of the country. You've also got like a blockade of goods that the military, is preventing from entering Rakhine, and airstrikes and so on. It's a very difficult context to build an administration within. But what I would say is that, one of the narratives that I sometimes hear is that, the Arakan Army just wants to drive out all Rohingya from Rakhine State into Bangladesh. And that's their real intention. But I don't think that I think that the evidence does not necessarily back that up. Even within Mongdo Township, the Arakan Army is taking very different approaches towards the Rohingya, in the north and around Mongdo town. And that seems to be based more on the perceived threat from Rohingya insurgent groups. That's why the Rohingya insurgency, one of the reasons why it worries me, is that we can already see how the Arakan Army will respond to that threat. That Rohingya communities will be caught between the two armed groups, and there'll be further damage to communal relations between the Rakhine and Rohingya communities. So I think there are important things that the Arakan Army can do, certainly including more Rohingya in its administration. It says it's already doing this, but my understanding is this is happening at a very low level, and I think that it needs to be expanded significantly. But also, they need to reach out more to the camp community in Bangladesh. I mean, this is the community that the armed groups are trying to mobilize. Arakan Army should be trying to undermine those efforts by engaging more regularly with leaders within the refugee community to make clear what their policies are, to have a more regular dialogue, to show what their real intention is, because that will be the best way to undermine the insurgency, to start rebuilding trust between the two communities.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, the last question is, you say any Rohingya attacks against the AA are unlikely to succeed. You write in the report, quote, further conflict between Rohingya armed groups and the Arakan Army is in the interest of neither the Rohingya people, Bangladesh, nor the Arakan Army. But of course, you don't mention there the SAC. So this may be in their interest. So how involved is the Myanmar military? Are they stirring up trouble?
Increasingly, that does seem to be the case. And I don't think it would be a surprise if the Myanmar military was trying to stir up trouble here. We just have to cast our minds back to last year when Arakan Army was advancing into Butidang and Mongdo, and the way the military responded. tried to build alliances with Rohingya armed groups. It tried to mobilize the Rohingya community using similar narratives to the Rohingya armed groups that, you know, the Arakan Army is the real enemy of the Rohingya people and so on, and they need to fight for their communities and for their security. And to some extent, the military was successful. I mean, the conflict last year in which, you know, some Rohingya fought against the Arakan Army did an incredible amount of damage, I think, to relations between the two communities. So I think that there is a level of interest from the Myanmar military in seeing a Rohingya insurgency against the Arakan Army. This is a classic divide and conquer or divide and rule strategy that the military has used around the country, particularly in areas of ethnic diversity. It picks one ethnic group and supports them against, you know, another ethnic group that it might be fighting against. In terms of concrete steps, we mentioned in the report that the Myanmar military sent a Rohingya person to Bangladesh in May to meet with the Rohingya armed groups. So I think that there is an attempt there to increase coordination with Rohingya armed groups and potentially provide support in the future in an attempt to undermine the Arakan Army.
Well, things never get any easier for the Rohingya. I mean, I think I speak for most when I say that hopefully cool heads will prevail and conditions will improve in the camps and in Rakhine State under AA rule with the SAC attacks and blockades. Listeners can read your report, Tom, by going to the show notes under this episode. Thanks for joining us to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Luke. I really appreciate it.
And if you're particularly interested in this story that we covered today with Tom Kean, we will be producing a Political Insider newsletter for members. Not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, that's June 29. That newsletter will be all about this particular issue, going a little bit more in depth. Now, that's only available for members, so be sure to sign up if you haven't already. And in wrapping up, let me again thank you for listening and staying on top of what's happening in Myanmar. We love it, by the way, when you give us feedback on the show. You can email whimyanmar@proton.me. And I'm going to do a little housekeeping now. Not only have we got some great new content on the website this week, including a feature on the recent landmark victories for garment workers in Myanmar, but we also have a major announcement. That is that seasoned journalist Tutu Aung will take over as Frontier Myanmar's editor-in-chief next month from Ben Dunant, who steps down after 7 years at the publication. We'll have more to say about that in the weeks ahead, but suffice to say, Frontier is very excited by this new chapter ahead under Tutu Aung's leadership. And we're incredibly grateful for Ben's stewardship over the last 3 years in particular. More soon on that. But until next week, now farewell and take care.